Well, that was wonderful. Thank you very much for that lovely rejoicing. I feel very warmed up, and also warmed up by seeing all of you. Yeah, lovely to just take you all in. Yeah, lovely. So, so I called my talk To Boldly Go, partly I had a sort of, not really a title, but, I was talking about the decision of the Buddha to go, and I was trying to make it a bit more, something. So I was thinking of to boldly go where no one's been before, you can think of that reference. Anyway, that's what came to mind. But also, as I thought about this topic, I was also reminded of when Sraddhagita introduced the retreat to us on that first night. And she talked about the 4 C's that we needed to be on this retreat. And as I was writing the talk, those 4 C's kept kind of weaving their way into the talk. So you'll see that the Buddha's going forth, the Buddha's boldly going, involves those 4 C's, those 4 qualities of commitment, curiosity, challenge, and community. So, tonight we're taking up that quest, making that decision, as I said, to leave. So it's about decisiveness, or rather we're not, hopefully we're not going to leave, but the Buddha is, the Buddha to be. And I really appreciated Sangadharan's talk last night. He very clearly and eloquently evoked the pleasure palace of the Buddha, but also our own pleasure palaces. And he said that we're always building pleasure palaces. And I also thought, well, we're always also making decisions, aren't we? And they're often based on wanting, not wanting. And that's not bad or wrong, but it won't actually lead us to freedom. It won't lead us to a sense of ease or release that we really long for. So, the traditional life story of the Buddha took, in a way you could say, centuries to develop, the one that we now often use or refer to. There are also very early versions of the Buddha's life story, from the Pali Canon, for example. So when you look at the Buddha's life story, you get both a kind of fairy tale sort of aspect, the real sort of story that draws us in, but you also get very simple accounts of him deciding to leave home and how he does that. And I'm going to be drawing on both of those things this evening. So both the simple accounts, but also the fairy tale sort of side, if you like. And I'm just writing the time down. This is a little trick I learnt so that I don't go too far over. So sometimes in some of these stories, the Buddha himself is telling his own story. And he's doing that to teach or to convey something. So I'll be drawing on that as well. So first of all, I wanted to sort of echo and maybe say a little bit more about stories and their power to move us. So we need poetry, we need drama, we need stories to activate our emotions and to activate us to move, to do something. And we want to activate as much of ourselves as possible for our practice. And one of the things that I was reflecting on is Sangharakshita, our founder, our teacher of Triratna. One of the things he said that we could try reading the Dharma more as literature and literature more as Dharma. So poetry and literature as Dharma, and Dharma as literature. So universal stories touch us, don't they? They move us, they encourage us to to try and bring all of ourselves with us when we're doing something. And this is a problem that we often encounter in our lives. How do we get our heart engaged? How do we actually find equivalence for what we actually understand with our mind, which is a great start. You know, it's really good to understand and know things with our mind, but we also need to know them in our heart. We need to know them in our body at that very deep level, like bone deep, if you like. So that's what things like the Metta Bhavana are trying to, bring out in us, trying to cultivate this sense of finding these emotional equivalents. And things like ritual are a way of doing that. Having a shrine is a way of drawing us in, isn't it? And kind of drawing us towards beauty, opening our hearts. All of those things create an atmosphere that touches us, that moves us. So you've all made a decision to leave the palace, your own palace. Whether that's a comfortable palace at home or it's an uncomfortable palace. Whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable, it's familiar to you, isn't it? And you've all decided to leave that, to come here. And, well, it's not that this palace doesn't have any pleasures, as we're finding out. For example, there's velvety chocolate mousse one evening, and then banoffee pie, the Buddhist version, the next, plus all the other beautiful pleasures that we're experiencing. Sanghadharan also mentioned, just sitting quietly when he was on a retreat and actually feeling contented, feeling deeply happy in himself. And in a way, he had nothing with him. He was just sitting there. It's often all the things that are unowned and not something we're trying to own or possess that give us the deepest happiness. So yeah, you've all made this decision and you've moved into what isn't necessarily always comfortable. Maybe sharing a room isn't comfortable. Maybe being with so many people on a huge retreat, it probably wasn't what you were expecting. And yet tonight when I came in, I thought, actually, it doesn't seem like the retreat's quite as big as it was at the beginning. And maybe there have been the odd person who decided it wasn't for them, but it feels like actually there's more of a sense of connection and community even after a couple of days. So it feels like not that we haven't expanded, but that we've more deeply connected. And I was also thinking, well, maybe your family and friends didn't want you to come. Maybe they didn't understand. Maybe they didn't approve. And all of that is, quite difficult to navigate, isn't it? Quite difficult to still decide to go on a retreat, especially at this time, which, has a lot of meaning for a lot of people. So you've all made quite a decisive decision by coming here. And sometimes when we do decide to do something, it does threaten other people. It threatens the status quo, it threatens the group, it challenges other people. Because people don't really like change very much. None of us sort of necessarily enjoy change. Sometimes we do, if things change into a way that we really like. But, we often sort of struggle with change or impermanence, if you like. So, yeah, people don't always want that. And you might have encountered that with other decisions you've made in your life. Like you might decide to become a vegan, and then suddenly, that's a big issue for people because they think, oh, I've got to cook these really tricky meals, and how's that going to work? And, and it also challenges them to think about what they're also eating or whatever it is, or maybe you give up alcohol, and that challenges people, doesn't it? Because it makes us all think. when friends give up things, it makes me think about my life and what am I doing? Is there something else I could do? So the Buddha made a really decisive decision when he decided to leave the palace. But as we'll see over the course of the next few evenings, really, he didn't just make one decision. He made a series of decisive decisions at different points in his life. And he also made mistakes, he made errors, and that's part of the quest. That is part of the journey. And it's usually in the making of mistakes, in the making of errors, that we grow, that we, sort of expand, we sort of get bigger. So that's really important. And this was when that first word that Sraddhagita mentioned the other evening, the commitment, really came up in my mind. I thought, well, the Buddha made this really decisive decision to commit to going. So, as I said, we're all in search of something. We were saying this last night as well. Meaning might be freedom, release, a release from suffering, more ease. And on our team retreat, one of the things that we did was we shared parts of our life stories with each other. So we shared some turning points. And here I was thinking for all of you, you've got more time to reflect on your life. How did you get here? How did you get to this point in your life? What is it that brought you here? And you can reflect on your life thus far and maybe see some of the decisive decisions that you've made that maybe led you to this decision. And then maybe you're already thinking about other decisions you might make. So the Buddha was acting on what he had seen and felt, and he embarks on a journey and a quest. And he doesn't really know what that would mean. He doesn't really know what that meant. He didn't really know if it was possible. Yes, he'd seen a wandering holy man. He probably had some kind of sense of India at that time and that there was a tradition of wanderers. So he would have seen that. He might have heard of teachers at that time, but he didn't really know what it would mean to actually leave. So he was going forth into the unknown to a large extent. And you might be sort of thinking, well, why is such a quest needed? So that's a question you could even ask yourself. Why is a quest needed? Why is a journey needed? Well, for the Buddha, he was aiming to solve an existential problem. He was trying to find freedom and release, you could say, from the predicaments of human life. So he really did have this existential problem. And the language of a quest doesn't always work for everybody. It isn't the only way that we can explore and reflect on the Buddha's life. So the language of a quest has a kind of heroic element to it, and that can really galvanize us. And I like that kind of sense of, moving, going, but then I'm a yoga teacher, but it might not appeal to everybody. But the other ways that we can think about the Buddha's life, there are also models of, for example, self-development or growing and cultivating and developing. So, as we learn about the Buddha's life, we'll learn about how he cultivated qualities, how he grew and expanded them. And then there's also the model of self-surrender. So letting go into what is already there. So on the first evening when we heard about Adhisthana and the meaning of Adhisthana, we heard that Adhisthana means blessings. So the model of self-surrender is opening to what's already there, opening to the blessings, a bit like opening to the metta that's already present in your experience. Rather than trying to squeeze it out or find it elsewhere, you're opening to what's there and you're slowly cultivating it and tending it. And then there's also the model of self-discovery, which an image for that would be a lotus just opening on its own accord. You know, it's not forced, there's nothing happening, it's just organically opening. It can't not open, it's just this lovely unfolding. So the Buddha didn't just notice the three sights, and they weren't just abstract ideas to him. The Buddha to be, rather. He's not quite the Buddha yet, Siddhartha. But he felt them on a visceral level. And this became a motivating force for him. It became a motivating force which directed his life. So he didn't allow his own youth, his own vitality, to distract him from these facts of life, this reality. He couldn't not see it, and he couldn't not feel it. And probably that's partly because, as we heard from Sangadharan, you know, there had been this prediction that he would either be a great ruler or a great spiritual leader. And so in the Buddhist tradition, there's this sense of, you know, he probably had had lots of different lives before that. He did have lots of different lives. He re-became, if you like, and finally, in his final birth, he became the Buddha. So just even thinking about that, it's not just this one lifetime we're thinking about in terms of Siddhartha. So for us, it's probably a more gradual, a more organic experience, this sense of the connection with these sights of old age, sickness and death. And they unfold over time. In my own experience, well, a bit like Sangadharan, I remember, actually two of my grandparents had died before I was even born. And then one of my grandparents died in Ireland. I'd only met her a few times. I didn't see her when she was dead. And then the same with my grandfather. It was only when one of my uncles, who just lived around the corner from us, my mum's brother, who was a bit younger than my grandparents, obviously, when he died, that had quite an impact, partly through seeing my mum's pain and sorrow at that, but also my young cousin and friend. She completely lost all her hair when her father died. And, you know, she had this lovely long blonde hair, and it just all fell out because, in a way, she didn't have a way of grieving or understanding or talking about that experience. I mean, I had a sense of it, but I was quite young too. So, yeah, I did have some encounters with death, but I don't think it was really until I actually went to India in my early 20s for 6 months, on a kind of journey, on a quest, if you like, that I felt like I really saw death much more strongly. I really saw old age and sickness. Death wasn't hidden in India. I spent quite a lot of time at Varanasi, and, you know, I saw the bodies sort of lined up really on these stretchers waiting to be taken to the burning ghats. And it was a very powerful experience to see this. And I remember watching a cremation, and, you know, I'd never seen anything like that before. And it did have a quite profound effect on me, which I don't think I immediately, of course, integrated or completely took in. I think with these things, we just need lots and lots of reminders. So for us, it's much more organic. But, that experience in India, it's never quite gone away. And then, it still informs the later losses that I've had and, people closer to me, my own parents, friends, close friends, and also I had my own sort of serious illness some years ago now. But, all of those things have informed my own sort of sense of impermanence. So for us, it is often more organic. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Buddhism is, well, one thing that's said about it is that in a way there aren't all these higher teachings. There are just deeper meanings, and we start to understand things more and more deeply. And I do feel as part of my practice, I do understand a bit more. I understand from my own experience something of what impermanence means, and I realise more and more that I am going to die. And, that does motivate me. It motivates me to practice. So, yeah, I too was on a sort of quest or a journey, as I mentioned, in India, and I was definitely looking for meaning. And I just wanted to just say something about the word dukkha as well, because often dukkha is translated as suffering or dissatisfaction. But I really like a translation of it from Bhikkhu Analayo, who's a Buddhist monk and scholar. And what he says about it is that the root meaning is it's not fitting well. It's not fitting well, or perhaps it's standing badly. In the Buddha's day, it was sort of described as an ill-fitting chariot wheel. So we'd have to translate that to, when your bike isn't running very smoothly and you need a bit of a service, you know how it is, and it's not at its best. And then you have the service and it's smooth, isn't it? And really, it's great. So, yeah, so it's that kind of dukkha that we often feel. So all the unsatisfactoriness that's inherent in life. And we're all searching for this meaning. And the Buddha sees how he and others have been searching for that. And the things he mentions are things like, well, in his day, those external things to keep one away from these experiences are things like having elephants and horses and servants and palaces and all of that. So, for us, maybe it's houses and holidays and, the sort of things that also Sanghadaran was talking about last night. And again, those things are not bad, they're not wrong, but they're not going to give us happiness. They're not really going to give us freedom. And we also know that on some level, these things, if it's the latest phone, well, at some point it'll stop functioning, it'll break. All these simple things that we think will just keep going, they will break down eventually. And it's really good to remember that. So the Buddha's quest, or the title of this whole retreat, is The Noble Quest. And, the opposite of that would be the ignoble quest. So it's only ignoble in comparison to the noble. So that's important to remember. So the noble quest is what's going to lead to this sense of release. And the Buddha-to-be, Siddhartha, had all these other experiences in other lives about, these themes of dukkha, these themes of letting go. So in one of the early suttas, the Arya Pariyasana Sutta, which is actually the sutta called the Noble Quest, or the Noble Search rather, and it's from the Majjhima Nikaya, which is part of the early Buddhist texts. What he says is, and I love this, it's something like, this is where the curiosity comes in. He realises that he's searching, or has searched, and we search, for what is subject to aging, to illness, to death, to tying us down. We search for those things to bring us happiness. And what he says is, suppose I search, suppose I. There's this lovely curiosity. What if I do this? Suppose I start to search for something that's more aging less, something which is illness less, something which is death less, something which is more sorrowless. And he also described it as like an unexcelled rest from the yoke. Imagine that. It's like we are often carrying this yoke, aren't we? And he talks about it in that way. And another word that he uses in the sutta is the unbinding. The unbinding. And when I heard that word, I just had this image of a sheaf, of corn, probably because I'd been reading about the Buddha's life and the yokes and the carts and all of that. But, that lovely sort of sheaf of straw that's all beautifully tied together, and it's packed, isn't it, really tightly. And then you cut the string and it all just releases. Lovely sound of release, that unbinding. Very, very beautiful. So he talks about that, and he sees that searching for happiness in what is subject to aging is not going to work. So, this is when he goes on the noble search, the noble quest. And then he says, this is how he describes his own leaving home. So, at a later time, while still a young, black-haired man, endowed with the blessings of youth, in the first stage of life, and while my parents were unwilling, were crying with tears streaming down their faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, I put on the ochre robe, and I went forth from the home life into homelessness. So it's a very, very simple account of the Buddha's leaving home. And it's different to the later versions of his leaving home, because in the later versions, and I'm going to read some of those and draw on those in a little while, it's much more that he leaves more in secret. But in this very, very simple, direct, sort of earlier version, he leaves with the obvious knowledge of his family and parents and, with the people. And there are tears, but he leaves, and it's quite simple. But later, as I said, in the later versions, there's more of a decision to leave his family, and often that includes his wife and his newly born child. And this can often draw quite a bit of controversy, especially for us as Westerners, modern, much more modern, leaving his wife and young son. But in India, there was much more of a culture of wandering, much more of a culture of, this sense of that was something that people did do. And in the later descriptions of the Buddha's the Buddha-to-be story, like, for example, there's a very poetic description in a text called The Light of Asia. We also see that it wasn't easy for the Buddha to leave. There's this lovely bit in that particular poem. It's like a poetic translation. And, for the Buddha to leave, it's heart-wrenching. He sort of circles the bed a few times where his wife and young son are sleeping, and it's not easy for him to go. But the other thing to remember is that in the Buddha-to-be's life, he was part of an extended family, so he knew that they would be looked after. And I think we also need to remember what Sanghadaran was saying last night, that when we're in the realm of story, we don't have to take it really literally. It doesn't mean it's not true, but it doesn't mean we have to take it literally. So what might that mean for us? Well, I was thinking what that means really. Well, one thing with this thing of him circling around, it's like he knows if he actually stays that his resolve will falter. But when he actually leaves his wife and young child in the story, he's leaving everything he holds dear. And we will also have to, at some point, leave everything that we hold dear. One day we'll have to leave those things. We'll have to say goodbye, and we'll have to let go. And today I was thinking about that because partly being here, the last time I was here and the last time I was speaking here was actually at the funeral of one of my very close friends. And I was giving a eulogy about her life. And after I'd given my eulogy, her partner came up. And, you know, she lived not in London, so I wasn't around her at the last few days, weeks of her life. But we were very close, and we did share a lot in our lives. But her partner came, and he gave a eulogy. And because quite a lot of her friends were sort of scattered around the country, the world even, he sort of really took us into his heart, and he shared something of her last days with all of us. And it was such a gift. And one of the things that he said was that there came a point when she said to him, "Let go of my hand. Let go of my hand." And then, not long after that, she died. So I think that part of the story is really telling us we will have to let go. So we can love, but we have to keep also letting go. So kiss the joy as it flies. Learn to love as best as we can, and at the same time keep trying to let go. So going back to these more poetic, elaborate descriptions of the Buddha's departure, the Buddha-to-be's departure, his father gets wind of him maybe going to leave, so he decides, I'll have to make a real effort to throw the most amazing party. It really needs to be grand, elaborate feast. I'm going to get the finest musicians, the best dancers, everything. It's going to be a really, really fine party. But the Buddha-to-be, Siddhartha, is already quite restless. And one of the lovely descriptions of him at this time was that he was almost like this tiger in a cage, and he was just restless. He needed to leave, it's like he needed to be out in the open air, out in the freedom of that experience. So during this party, he basically falls asleep. I mean, it's like his dad's put on this amazing party, there's everything you could possibly want, and he just falls asleep. And then because of that, the musicians think to themselves, well, if he's sleeping, maybe I'll just take my chances, I'll have a little nap. And his father had also put all these guards at the gates to stop the Buddha to be leaving, because he thought this is going to be the night. So they also fell asleep. And then, of course, the Buddha woke up. The Buddha-to-be woke up. And I keep saying the Buddha, partly because the Buddha does mean, or the word Buddha does mean awake. And I'm focusing on sleeping and waking up. So anyway, he wakes up and he sees that everyone has fallen asleep apart from him. And he really sees the aftermath of this feast, this party. Like there's all these disheveled parties. It's a bit like, when you've been on a long-haul flight. When I went on a long-haul flight to Australia for the first time last year, when we got off the flight, it was like I was looking around and there were all these discarded blankets and, the eye masks and everything. And it was just like this party that had happened in the air. Just all these people were, of course, wanting to get off the plane because we've been on it for so long. So it's something like that. But he sees it and he's like, now's the time, gotta go, So he calls his servant Channa, and he asks him to bring his beloved horse, Kantaka. And as I mentioned, the doors had been locked and the guards were there, but they'd fallen asleep. So one thing about Chantaka and the horses, I was thinking, the Buddha-to-be doesn't leave in a chariot. This time he leaves on a horse. And for me, a horse represents that sense of energy, passion, aliveness, freedom, boldness. And you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, but that horse is going to make quite a bit of noise, isn't it? There's probably all those cobbled floors out of the palace, How's he going to get out? Well, this is when some magic happens. So, as the horse starts to gallop, the devas appear. So the devas are like the gods and goddesses. And they appear with these beautiful cloths. And as the horse, Kantaka, gallops, the devas come and put these cloths under the horse's hooves to muffle the sound, so that the Buddha-to-be can leave the palace. And as he nears the gates, they just roll open, like magic. They were locked, but they suddenly roll open. So these devas and devis, as they're called, the gods and goddesses, when they appear, that's a sign that the universe is starting to respond. It's starting to become a universal matter that Siddhartha is leaving. So he's leaving everything he knows. And I like to imagine that he does look back. He looks back at those twinkling lights in the palace. And he also, though, looks up at the stars shining in the sky. And here at Adhisthana, we get much more of a sense of those stars shining, don't we? Lovely, clear skies, not so much light pollution. So, the twinkling of the stars, which is so much more beautiful than any of those twinkly lights of the palace. So I get a sense of him looking at that. But I also get this real sense of him taking this huge risk. He's entering the unknown. And one thing we might want to just even reflect on a little bit is, well, the Buddha-to-be's made this decision. How do we make decisions? Do we take risks? Do we stick to our decisions? Do we allow ourselves to make mistakes? So the Buddha-to-be gallops away on the horse, Chantaka, with his servant Channa. And he's wearing his princely robes, he's wearing jewels, everything that adorns him. But he needs to let go of that. He needs to give that up. So there's another layer that he can let go of. And Channa and him cross what's called the Anomar River, which was a sort of boundary between the land owned by Siddhartha's father and another piece of land. And there he meets a beggar, and the beggar's probably really surprised to be suddenly asked to swap clothes and given these princely robes, all these jewels, and he probably can't quite believe it. And the Buddha says, well, Buddha-to-be, can we swap? Can I have your rags, please? But I think for me as well, this really creates this real sense of when we go forth, when we leave, we leave in a bit more of a vulnerable way, don't we? We haven't got all our adornments and our fine clothes. We're going a bit more nakedly. And yeah, that is a bit more vulnerable. Then he cuts off his long dark hair, and again the devas appear. So this is a very symbolic renunciation, if you like, the cutting off of his hair, the sincerity of his aspiration. You could say again that the stars are aligning, the devas are coming, the universe is responding. And then he thanks his servant Channa, he thanks his horse. And Channa wants to join him. He says, well, can I come with you? And he says, no, you need to go back, to tell my father. And then the horse doesn't want to move. In fact, the horse refuses to move. So he has to go and talk to Kantaka, talk to the horse to soothe him. And then, he goes off. So the Buddha to be is on his own. And I was thinking, Sraddhagita mentioned that we were ordained on the same retreat quite a few moons ago. We won't say how many, but anyway, I was thinking for me that's been a very strong aspect, a very strong sort of decision to go forth, go for refuge into what's unknown, what is mysterious. Some of it's a bit known, but when you do make that commitment, you do sort of, you are opening to something quite mysterious. But I do remember very vividly, we were ordained in Wales, and on the night of my own private ordination, you have a private and a public ordination. I was ordained by a woman called Dharmadina, and on that night I did read from the Light of Asia about the Buddha's going forth, the Buddha to be's going forth. And I found it very, very moving to read that, as I myself felt like I was going forth to some extent. It did feel like a decisive commitment, a decisive move. And in a way, I'm still working that out in lots of ways. Not in the sort of, in more subtle ways, it's like it's an ongoing exploration of what that means. But I want to come back to this universal matter of, being bold, taking a step. Because the Siddhartha doesn't know, where he's going. He's had this glimpse of, the holy wanderer. So he hasn't yet found the fourth C, which is community, but hopefully we will hear about that as the story unfolds. And I think for me, I felt that although I learnt to meditate in India, and that's where I came across the Dharma, it wasn't really until I came to the LBC that I found a community to practice with. So I don't know if I would have just ended up going along to a Buddhist centre in Bethnal Green if I hadn't been to India. I didn't even know that was really what I was looking for, although I was looking for some kind of meaning. But when I came back to London, I definitely wanted to find somewhere that I could practice, and I found that sense of community at the London Buddhist Centre. And I'm going to finish the talk with a couple of readings, really, which have something of this quality of the universe responding. When we commit to something, the universe does respond. I'll read a couple of things. So the first one's from the musician and writer Patti Smith. I've just brought this book to read. It's called Devotion. Haven't really started it apart from looking at the front page. But the first thing I read was this, so I thought I'd share it with you. Inspiration is the unforeseen quantity, the muse that assails at the hidden hour. The arrows fly, and one is unaware of being struck, and that a host of unrelated catalysts have joined clandestinely to form a system of its own, rendering one with the vibrations of an incurable disease, a burning imagination, at once unholy and divine. And then, from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, until one is committed, there is always hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans, that the moment one definitely commits oneself, then providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help one that would never otherwise have occurred. A whole stream of events issues from the decision, raising to one's favour all manner of unforeseen incidents and meetings and material assistance, which no one could have dreamed would come their way. Whatever you can do or dream, you can begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it.